Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor can tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Gösta Gabriel. We're going to be talking about the Sumerian Kings List. So, this is a text, or maybe even a collection of texts, that basically list these kings that lived really, really long time, thousands and thousands of years. And many might be familiar because it has a little bit of similarities with the genealogies of the Bible and Genesis. So, we're going to be talking about these long ages. What is the text doing? Historical questions. Who are the people on the list? Why was this text made? How are you doing today, Dr. Gabriel?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
I am doing great. This is going to be a real fun one. So, many are familiar, or I should say unfamiliar with this Sumerian Kings List. Can you talk about just what specific texts that we have that include the list? Like, when are they written, stuff like that.
Yeah. So maybe I start with the question: what is the Sumerian King List?
That's a
And
good one too.
it's maybe or as far as I know, it's the first systematic approach to the history or the past that we find in ancient Mesopotamia. And so it's the first time that we have a systematic notion of some of the past and how it happened. And when I talk about the past or history, we're talking about political history. So it's a source for political historiography, and the oldest we have from ancient Mesopotamia, which qualifies as one of the oldest worldwide. And so how old is it? The oldest extant manuscript originates from the 21st century BCE. So we're talking about 4,000 years. And it gives us a notion of the past that goes back even further. And as you said, the early kings reigned quite long. So we're talking about several thousand years. They remembered as their past. Yeah.
Mm.
And reading it is first, just reading it, it's a bit boring because it's very repetitive. So the information we get is what is the capital of the country and which kings ruled for how long. And that's roughly all the information we get. But already in this little thing, we get some concepts about the past, because there's always one capital for the country. There are not two. So it's the idea of linearity in history. And then we have always only one king of this city. And then after a certain time, kingship is passed on to another city, and then we have a new capital. Yeah. So this is the text in one variant. So this is something we are dealing with today, I guess, a bit more often, is the multiplicity of sources and the variety of sources. And this is more or less what we got from the best preserved manuscript. It's a prism. We have that up here. Do you see my cursor? No,
I
not
don't
really.
see your screen, but what I can do
No,
is
what you showed us. Yeah, this one. Yeah, this is the Weld-Blundell prism. A nice one. It's today in the Schmolny Museum in Oxford, and that's the best preserved manuscript. It gives us the entire king list, which mostly is not the case. Mostly we have cuneiform tablets, clay tablets that break off, and this is an almost complete copy. Yeah, and what you showed us was the translation of this piece.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a bunch of different, I guess, tablets that include parts of this on here.
Yeah.
They're not all exactly the same, right? As we'll
No.
talk about.
Yeah.
And that what you're saying is this one that I have on the screen here is just like the most like complete copy
Yeah.
of all the different little sources we have. Okay, so very interesting. So let's see here, and so I guess an important thing to ask, like, what is generally like on these texts? So you talked about the the general, like, this many years, this many years. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, then it depends on which version of the Sumerian King List we're talking about, which version we're talking. The one you have shown, that we have more information, but the oldest copy, for instance, that's all the information we get. Only in case of 2 or 3 kings, we get affiliation, so we know who's the father. So this the king before was the father of the following king. We get this information 2 or 3 times in the text, and that's it. Apart from that, we only get the information who is king, for how long, and what is the capital. And that kingship is transferred from one city to another. And something that all texts of the Sumerian King List share is the beginning of political history. And this is that the gods brought kingship down from heaven. So when we're talking about kingship, it's a divine object. It's given by the gods, and it's itself divine. So it's eternal. And the political change is explained by the movement of kingship from one city to another. And who's the agent behind that? These are the gods again. We know that from other texts. The Sumerian King List does not mention any deity at all, but we have this idea in the back and needing to be spelled out.
Oh, so basically what you're saying is we don't have any explicit deities in this text, but we have other texts that like give us the idea of, like, I guess, the context, the background of what they're thinking in their heads. That's why they don't mention them. Interesting. Okay. So there's a really interesting thing that you've talked about in your work, which is that the first part, it was added afterwards. Is that correct? Could you talk about that? What was going on there?
Yeah. Would you like to? Perfect.
Yes. So this whole first section was added on after all of this, afterwards.
Yes. Yeah, afterwards. Yeah, it was added sometime in the 18th century BCE, and this gives us the idea of an antediluvian time. So we see in the end of the paragraph, then the flood swept over, and after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, and this is the original beginning. After kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This is the original beginning of the text, and we see that another paragraph was included. So why did this happen? And it's a kind of longer story. I try to wrap it up. So first, this is the flood, the same flood we know from the Bible. So there's the deluge, and the question is, when did this idea that there was this primeval flood, when was it developed? And my colleague Samuel Chen, he developed a quite intriguing and convincing, compelling argument that was actually developed around 2000 BCE. Before that, when he studied all the sources we have, and we see the same term that is used for the flood as here in the Sumerian King List, and there we see that it has a different meaning. So the idea of a primeval flood was created around 2000 BCE. Why? And I know all these documentaries about the historical flood and what kind of natural catastrophe could have been the source of inspiration. And Samuel Chen's work shows us that we are looking in the wrong direction then, when we look for a natural disaster, because it was a political disaster. It was the collapse of the so-called Third Dynasty of Ur. It was an empire in Babylonia. It's in southern Mesopotamia. It collapsed around 2000 BCE. And this collapse was a catastrophe for the elite. It doesn't look like it was so catastrophic for the normal people, but for the elite, it was a catastrophe. And after that, they wrote several texts, the so-called city laments, about this great disaster. And they narrate this event in terms of the metaphor of a flood, of a storm, of a flood. And Samuel Chen showed that this idea was then taken out of the historical context, and the idea was developed. This has happened before and was an actual flood. Why was that important? It was important for the new kings, that they said, we had this catastrophe, and after that, a new era began. And so we are at the beginning of a new era. and a new era of stability. And so this was a part of their royal legitimization. And so this is where the idea of the flood comes from, most likely. So no natural disaster, but a political catastrophe, and the metaphor used for that. Okay, so around 1800 BCE, we had the Sumerian King List, a story about the past. And we had the idea of this primeval flood in the past. And so it was quite obvious that these two things had to be brought together. And this happened in two steps. In the first step, something like the Sumerian King List was developed for the primeval time, the antediluvian time. So what we get is an antediluvian King List, a self-standing text, an independent text. But it has roughly the same structure as the Sumerian King List. And then in the next step, this was integrated in the Sumerian King List, this antediluvian King List. It became part of the Sumerian King List. And we can see that it was integrated. And maybe you can show us the text again. I would like to point out one important aspect that we can see also the beginning of the second paragraph here. No, it was perfect. Okay. Sorry. It's perfect like that. So when we read at the very beginning, line 1, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. So this is the beginning of the political history before the flood, and then after the flood, line 40, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. So we see two descents of kingship from heaven. Mm-hmm. So scholars have argued maybe the flood destroyed kingship, so it needed to be brought down a second time. But there's even more here, because we have this independent antediluvian king list. And we have all this information about the kings of Eridu and Patibira, etc. But we have never ever this first line that kingship was brought down from heaven. This is not included in the antediluvian king list. So this is something that is specific for the Sumerian king list. And when the antediluvian king list was integrated in the entire thing, the question was, where do we integrate this entire new paragraph about the antediluvian kings? And the only result possible was right at the beginning. I can talk about the reason why. And now there was the need to, because we have kings before the flood, so kingship has to be been brought down from heaven a first time. And so this was added too. So this is that we have this descent from heaven to Eridu is a result of the integration of the antediluvian king list and the Sumerian king list. So it's a artifact of this textual merger.
Wow. Okay, so that was a lot of information. All right. Okay, and so basically what you're saying is this, what we're having on the screen here, this whole section right here, it was originally just a list of a pre-flood people or people or whatever, and how if these are actual people or characters, it maybe is a better way to put it, kings, and they were originally one text. So how do we know? Do we have like a source that only has the list of kings on it?
Yeah, we have 5 manuscripts only listing these antediluvian kings.
Oh wow!
So we have the actual text.
Yeah, that's a lot of sources there. Yeah. So it's not just like one. It's like there's a lot of there. Yeah. So that's a pretty crazy coincidence to have 5 separate sources if they weren't originally individualist.
And that's the reason why we know that the first line wasn't part of it.
Ah, okay. So this part right here was not in the other texts.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. So they added it later after they added the first section onto this list, right?
Yeah.
All right. And so what you argue, what you think is the best evidence is that this was originally, like, this part of the text was on it, then it was added later because they thought themselves, hey, we have there was a flood at one point, so we have to incorporate that into our history. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We
Wow.
had the new idea of a flood in the past, and this had to be part of the narrative of the past.
Okay. Wow.
So
Very
to be
fascinating.
included.
Okay. And that brings all kinds of interesting questions. We'll get into that in a second, but um, let's see here. Yeah. So, um, could you remind us one more time, like what was the purpose? I mean, it seems like there was actually a lot of different purposes for mentioning
Yeah.
these different types of things. Like each additional edit had its own purpose to it, right?
Yeah.
But just broadly speaking, what was the purpose of having a list of these different kings and this king lived in this area for this long? Like, why would that be important to anybody?
Um, because of the linearity of a kingship, there's only one kingship. It's given by the gods at the beginning of history, brought down to earth, given to the kings of the first city, and then it moves on. It develops a thread from heaven to the actual ruler. So the actual ruler has an argument that his kingship is the kingship given by the gods. So it's about legitimization. It gives us the idea that this is divine kingship he holds.
Okay.
And he's
So,
according that, the illegitimate ruler of the entire country.
so is this the idea that, like, hey, the deities, the gods, they chose this king, and therefore there has to be like a kingdom chosen, like we have to get our lineage from chosen by the gods. So that brings an interesting question. Like, why would they think that like something like that has to be passed down?
It has to be passed down because, at least according to the idea of the Sumerian Kings List, there's only one kingship, and it's a divine, mostly almost like an object. It's a divine object, and it was given by the gods to humanity, and it was given to the first city, and then it's passed on. And now this divine entity is in our city, and this city is capital. And because our ruler is the king of that capital, he's king of the entire country. So this is more or less the argument we have here. What's interesting here, it's another idea of continuity and of lineage, and compared to the dynastic principle. So it's different than a dynasty. Quite often we speak about the dynasty when we speak of the rule of a capital in the Sumerian King List. So when you read the literature, quite often people write these are dynasties. But when you're more precise, they are not dynasties. They're not held together by family relations, but through this divine object and the city it is in.
Okay.
So the dynastic idea was later integrated in the Sumerian King List, but it's not originally. It's not a dynastic principle that we have here.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. All right. And in that case, can you tell us about the first section? So I think you actually mentioned this in your habilitation that you wrote on this, which is like the equivalent of a dissertation. You mentioned that this was originally like part of a creation account. Is that right?
We also, it's the question is how we also have a creation account of creation of humankind, and in this account we have the idea of the flood, and this is the flood we find in the Bible, the same context. How and it looks like they're related, and the same flood, the same idea. But we do not have this idea of creation in the Sumerian King List. Only the idea of the flood. But it's the idea that there was God created mankind. There was a problem. The problem was kind of solved or not solved by the flood, and then mankind survived, and history goes on.
Okay. All right. But so like you mentioned, like 6 or 7 or 8 sources or whatever for this first part of the text, the pre-flood text. So we don't have are you saying that we don't have a text with those kings on it and a creation account?
Yeah.
We don't have that.
We have the so-called Sumerian Flood Epic. We have two manuscripts of that, dating also to 18th century BCE, roughly. And there we have this story about that humankind was created and that humankind got too loud, and so it's a different reason why the gods sent the flood. Then the flood is sent. Humankind survives because there's a hero building a boat, and and then history goes on. But it looks like the Sumerian Flood Epic is a later version of this narrative. It looks like the narrative is older, and the question is how the idea of kingship and this flood narrative were connected. And it looks like the Sumerian King List was one of the reasons why they were connected. Why is that? Because the flood hero originally is no king, but in the Sumerian Flood Epic and in the Sumerian King List, the flood hero becomes a king.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And so just for...
Sorry, it's always a bit
so
complex history.
And at least this text, you have Ubara Tutu. From my reading, this is supposedly the father of Ziusudra from the Sumerian Flood Epic. So in the Sumerian Flood myth, you have a text that just says like Ziusudra, son of Ubara Tutu. That's like the only reference. But in this text, it's interesting because it doesn't mention Ziusudra at all.
In this version, we have another one which actually mentions Ziusudra.
Interesting. Okay. That's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so as far as the purpose of this text, there's other purpose as we mentioned for each edition. Did you have anything you wanted to add there?
To the antediluvian part?
Well, actually, yeah, let's actually talk about that. So, yeah, what is the antediluvian part? Like, what, maybe people are maybe not familiar with that idea. What is, it's like, that's just pre-flood. Is that all that it is? Is there any significance to people that lived before the flood in this context?
There are a few things. So first, the 5 cities mentioned here, there are 5 antediluvian capitals. Eridu, Patibira, Larak, Zimbir, the Zippor, and Shuruppak. And these 5 cities are not mentioned as capitals after the flood. So this is one aspect that is interesting here. The second is mostly we do not know these people. There's one major exception from the rule, that's Dumuzi the shepherd. This is there. This is what we know as a god, the lover of the goddess Inanna Ishtar, that had to die, and who was a shepherd and a king. So we see there's a mythology also here, very brief, very terse. No more information about this figure Dumuzi, but Dumuzi the shepherd, there rings a bell for every Mesopotamian reading it. And the second one, I think we also talked about that, is Emendor Anna. And we also have this Emendor Anki, and there are also some other variants of this name. This is a sage. This is a sage or a king connected to a sage, one of the 7 sages, antediluvian sages. So there's also some story around this figure. And maybe there's even more around the others, but we do not know.
Okay. So we don't know for sure if they're just like making up random names.
But most likely they're not just random names.
Interesting.
I'm pretty sure they had some idea behind that. It's the question whether we can decipher these ideas.
Yeah.
And at least in the case of Dumuzi, we know for sure that's Dumuzi the god, the shepherd, the lover of Inanna Ishtar. And we have a bit of story around this Emendor Anna. But in the case of the others, there's almost nothing.
I see.
Nothing.
Okay. And
And
no, keep going.
Last aspect that is intriguing is the length of the reign. We see like 800 years, 36,000 years, and etc., etc. So this adds up to more than 240,000 years for just 8 kings. These are just fantastic numbers. And the question is, why do we have these huge numbers? And there's some discussion about that. And one reason, something Georg Gabriel stressed, is we need to read these numbers in the context of the sexagesimal system. So the number system that they had that is based on the number 60. So we need to think about in the decimal system. And these are all multiples of 60. But why do we have these high numbers? And first, I should say there's no explicit information in the text or anywhere else. So we have no historic explanation, or we have no explanation from the Mesopotamians why we have these huge numbers. But we can extrapolate from the sources that it's the idea that before the flood, and something we find also in the flood narrative, the flood myth, that before the flood there was nothing, it looks like there was no such thing as natural death. So people were immortal. It's hard to have a succession of kings when you have immortality. So to negotiate both things is to have the idea of incredibly long reigns. So one explanation why we have this long reigns is it gives us a notion of some kind of immortality without being really immortal. And the second thing is, when we compare these incredibly high numbers with the numbers after the flood, we see they're much lower. They're still in the thousands a few times, or the hundreds. So no biologically possible numbers. Before the flood, they are even larger, by 60, by 600. And the question, the information we get through that is, before the flood, kings ruled longer. Capitals were in power much longer. What does it mean? It means before the flood, there was much more stability. So there's another aspect of the Sumerian king list. We have the idea there's one kingship, one capital, one king at a certain time. And this is stable. So we have this capital, and this capital rules the country for millennia, centuries, whatever. Political change, which is always catastrophic, is limited to the very brief notion of the change of kingship from one city to another. And maybe you can show us the text again, just to show as an example. Let's go to the end of the second paragraph. 23 kings. Here. 23 kings, they ruled for 24,000 years, whatever. Then Kish was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Eana, which is the city of Uruk. It's meant here. So this is the only moment of political instability. We have military defeat, and then kingship is taken by the gods and given to another city. And then again, we have a moment of stability, or millennia of stability. So what the Sumerian King List does is to negotiate the actual experience of political change, of wars, of change of power on the one hand, and the idea of stability. And so instability is curtailed to these short moments. So coming back to the antediluvian time, when we have this incredibly long reigns of 10,000s of years, it means in these times we have peace in the country. There's no war. And only then we have these short moments of change, and then again we have these incredibly long periods of stability. So this is also a way to render a golden age. So before the flood, we have had something like politically of a golden age. And
that's fascinating.
This is also one other kind of reading of these incredibly high numbers.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And on that topic, some have argued that these are like symbolic, like a symbolic way of saying like, hey, these kings are really, really, really great. Um, do you see that as any possibility?
Yeah, yeah, sure. The length of reign is also, yeah, the longer you're a king, the more you can do. And
Hmm.
this is, of course, also a cipher for these are important kings. Yes,
Hmm.
I would agree to that. Not in all cases, but as a general tendency, I would say yes.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So that brings up an interesting question about the ages then. So obviously nobody was there to write down how long they lived. Um,
Yeah.
but and that might even seem ridiculous today. I've heard some scholars argue that hey, these people like they knew that people didn't live that long, but so like they must be like symbolic, but there's still an aspect of it's just like where did the numbers come from? Like did they just make them up, or what is that aspect? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, well, we can, as I did, we can explain the quantity in a on a more general level, but
Hmm.
the specific numbers, it's almost impossible to say, especially for the early kings.
Hmm.
Why
Yeah.
this king 28,800 years, the other king 36,000 years? Does it weigh them against each other? Is the one more important than the other? It's it's not really possible to say. What we can say about numbers later in the Sumerian King List,
Hmm.
they become historical accurate.
Hmm.
When we talk, for instance, about the King Shulgi, 48 years, we have to go down very far. Or yeah, Ur-Nama
Mhm.
became king. He ruled for 18 years. Shulgi, the son of Ur-Nama, ruled for 46. Yeah, 48 is the accurate number
Oh, interesting.
historically. Um, so these numbers are, as far as we can say, they're historically correct. So and there's a middle part, a gray part, where it's hard to say whether they are actual accurate or just made up.
Hmm.
Whatever made up means.
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure they had an idea why they picked this number of years and not another one.
Hmm. Yeah.
But here we are in the accurate section.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, this is a really long list.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how they would add to it? So you have the essentially the a certain base text that didn't have the pre-flood people on it,
Yeah.
and then later you have other kingdoms adding to it. So um, is that just making the like a previous claim, like just like the same with the other ones, just adding to the list and saying, hey, like we're the rightful rulers, or what's going on there?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a nice summary of the textual history. So we have a first text, an Ur text, and then each redaction meant that new ideas were added. And this is typical for the traditionalistic Mesopotamian culture.
Hmm.
So you didn't erase what was handed down to you. Instead, you used that material, reshaped it, added new things. And so you further developed it. And in this way, you integrated your own ideas into this text. And in the case of the Sumerian King List, we see it was very important, very influential, because we see all these redactions. Some of them, we have actual manuscripts that are testimony to the specific variant. In some cases, we have to extrapolate that from the source.
Hmm.
And but this is possible. We can identify strata, and we can attribute these strata to specific kings or
Hmm.
dynasties. We understand why they added them and what was the idea behind that. And then when you take these strata away and peel them off one after the other, you get to the original core of the text.
Hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, so what we have is always a very complex entity with many layers, and each layer means a different notion, a different idea of political history. And each younger dynasty or group of rulers tried, of course, to include their own ideas. As we had with the integration of the antediluvian part that was integrated by the Easing kings, because for the Easing kings, the idea of the flood was very important for their own legitimization. And this had to become a part of this kind of master narrative of the past.
Okay. And I believe you talked about in your habilitation that when people would add like extra kings to the list, that they sometimes they were perfectly okay with like editing prior lists. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what is the logic behind that?
We do not know where exactly the added kings come from. We do not know whether they were different lists, competing lists, they were integrated, like in the case of the antediluvian part, or if they consulted dedicated objects in the temples to check what kind of rulers do we have there, do we have any kind of information about these earlier kings, whatever. So there's a huge part we do not really know. But we know for sure that they added this new material to the existing list. And each time this was done to convey a certain idea of history of the past. And to give you maybe one example, this is the ruler UT-Hegal. That's the one that's the one before Shulgi and Ur-Namma. So this so-called Ur-3 dynasty at the 21st century BCE. Before that, we have one single ruler of the city of Uruk, UT-Hegal. And he is the one who kicked out the Gutians out of the country. And there's a famous inscription of him where he tells about his great victory about the Gutians. And something that already Piotr Steinkeller worked out is that we can attribute some of these capitals to a redaction of King UT-Hegal. These are 3 cities or 3 capitals or hegemonies, as I like to call them. The one is, of course, himself, that he's the ruler of Uruk, and so that he is mentioned in the Sumerian King List. He also added the Gutians. And in the first case, this is quite strange, because the Gutians were the arch enemy of the Mesopotamians. At least they were labeled at that in the cultural memory. So why would you add these kings? And this was important because he kicked out the Gutians out of the country. So there must have been Gutians in the country. So you need to include them. And his idea was also, he brought back kingship to Uruk. So there needs to be the idea in the past that kingship is something that was in Uruk and comes back to Uruk. And so he also included a hegemony of Uruk before the Gutians. And all these rulers he mentioned, some of them seem to be historically accurate, but they were entirely unimportant. There were no big rulers. But he included them because he needed the idea of kingship coming back to Uruk. So then kingship had to be in Uruk before the Gutians. So he included that. And so we can see that these 3 hegemonies, Uruk, Gutium, Uruk, this was kind of was a product of the redaction of the king UT-Hegal. And as I said, this is not only what I figured out, but also a colleague of mine.
Fascinating. Okay, so just so people have a good idea here. So is it this section right here that you're saying that was added?
Yeah.
And this is just a group of people that you're saying that weren't that important, and they were added because they had to have some Gutians that were on the list because they were ruling before. They already knew that, so that we had to put someone there. Is that the context there?
Yeah, and the question is, what do we make out of the names? Are these actual names or made-up names.
Yeah.
I think in a few cases, we can connect them with actual historical Gutian rulers, but in many cases we do not really know. But here, a look on the numbers is quite telling. You see the reigns are very short. And this labels the Gutian rule as a very unstable rule. So it's something bad. So when you look at this passage, you have a lot of rulers, and in total, this is not very long. So this was a bad time for Mesopotamia. And this is also communicated through the numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. So just for clarity, so this guy ruled 2 years. This guy ruled 2 years. This guy 1 year, 2 years. And then the next king, 427 years.
Well, this is a variant, a misreading. So the one in the brackets is the correct one. But here, the last king is of the Gutians, Tiriga. He's called here 40 days.
40 days. And, oh, interesting.
Yeah. And this is the ruler that was defeated by UT-Hegal.
Interesting. Okay, so
he's
you're
the worst king ever.
What? Say that again?
He's the worst king ever.
He's the worst king ever because he ruled for so little.
Yeah.
That's basically the message they're sending.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting that you said that the 427 was off. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. But then, like, if
it's a misreading by the ancient scribe of the Wild-Blundell prism of the object you showed us in the beginning.
Interesting. Okay, but was it 26 was the real one?
I have to check. I think the 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days is the correct one.
7 years, 6 months. Okay. Yeah. All right. Interesting. Okay. But even then, like 7 years, 6 months, that's not that much bigger than Jarlaganda ruled for 7 years.
No. But I think it's accurate. So this is UT-Hegal didn't rule that long.
So you're saying the original text is not like the one we're looking at right here is not accurate, or?
No. It's so the 7 years, 6 months, and 5 days or 15 days. This is an accurate number. It looks like an historically accurate number. And then Ur-Namma takes over, who was most likely a general of UT-Hegal.
Okay. So the 7 years. Okay. So this is Unag. That's what you said. Is that Uruk?
That's Uruk. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the actual writer, so like he would have known this, but he wouldn't have known, like we don't have any reason to think that he would know this historically accurate, right?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, that's a fun intro to the topic there. All right. So there's two historical fun parts that people want to know about. So, is this historically accurate? That's one question. And then we'll get to the second one in a second. But so, like, it seems like you're saying that like some of these, like the people writing, they did have a way to verify, so we can be confident that they are historically accurate. They match up with the text. There are parts that are not historically accurate. Like, I think one big thing they talk about, like scholars talk about, is the pre-flood texts. Like there wasn't just one group of people ruling. Like there was all kinds of people, other different cities. Or could you talk about that?
About historical accuracy in general, or
yeah, sure. In general, like there's some parts. Well, what maybe a better way to put it is, what are the parts where we know are not historically accurate?
Well, we know what's not historically accurate are the early parts. Of course, we have numbers that are biologically impossible, so we know for sure these are not accurate, at least the numbers. With the names, the antediluvian part, these names are not actual names of rulers. They are taken from a different source, but we do not know which source exactly it was. Okay. And in the case of Dumuzi, it's a god integrated in the Sumerian Kings List, and this god was also perceived as one of the first rulers or the first ruler. Yeah, so yeah, that's always the question. What do we mean by historically accurate? But let's stick to the numbers. So in the early parts, we can say for sure what's biologically impossible. These are made up numbers. In the case of the Gutians, we are not really sure, but it could be that they're made up to label them, characterize them as bad rulers, because we have always these kind of changes, and change is bad from a Mesopotamian perspective. From the elite perspective, I should say. And then we have the parts like the kings of Agade, like Sargon, Naram-Sin, etc. These numbers look accurate too. And like the kings of Ur, the kings of Isin. Yeah, and then there's a gray part. We cannot really say. So it's a combination of Piotr Steinkeller called it mythical history. So he doesn't talk about history, but mythical history. It's remembered history and remembered past. And this does not only include everything that we perceive as accurate, but just everything they remembered. And this also included the gods and legendary heroes, etc. And they were also part of this grand narrative of the past, or could become part of that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and for example, there's the section of the first kings of Uruk, the legendary kings like Gilgamesh and in Merkara and Lugalbanda. Yeah, and then we have Gilgamesh and Lugal, in Merkara. Yeah, there he is. And we can be sure that they were not actual kings. They are wherever they come from. This is a different story. We could talk about that too, about the origin of Gilgamesh, for instance.
Yeah.
But they became part of the Sumerian King List quite late. So the idea behind that was to make them part of the grand narrative, to have this legendary kings, heroes, whatever, be part of this grand narrative. So this section is a later addition, and we can be sure that these kings never existed.
And tell, so what's the logic for you saying that we can be confident they didn't exist?
When we can do, well, how do we know? We have the sources. We have sources about some of these, about Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh, sources dating to the 3rd millennium, and they start around the middle of the 3rd millennium. And I did that for Gilgamesh. So in the case of Gilgamesh, I'm sure, I collected all the evidence that we have for Gilgamesh before the 21st century BCE. And surprisingly, nobody had done that before. Andrew George, in his grand and great edition of the Gilgamesh epic, collected the evidence to a certain degree, but he never analyzed it systematically. So he pointed out that we have the notion of Gilgamesh as a king, as Gilgamesh as a hero, and Gilgamesh as a god. But there's so much he did in his edition. There was no space to go deeper. So I'm very grateful what he did. So I used that as a starting point. I collected all the evidence that we have for Gilgamesh, and then it became quite clear that there was no idea of Gilgamesh as a hero and king before the 21st century BCE. We have Gilgamesh, but Gilgamesh is a god. We can characterize the god as a netherworldly deity with a warrior aspect, and his mother's Ninsumuna, an important deity, goddess. That's it. There's no notion of Gilgamesh being a king of Uruk, as he's remembered later. There's no idea of Gilgamesh as a hero. And in this case, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, because we have a huge number of sources. We have information about Gilgamesh, so we learn a lot about this character. And if there had been the idea of Gilgamesh as a former king and hero, it would have been there somewhere, but it's not there, not at all. So the picture is entirely clear that Gilgamesh originally is a god, and in the 21st century he was turned into this notion of a former king and hero. And
Fascinating.
you can nail it down, but this is a different story.
Yeah.
I think it brings us too far from the away from the Sumerian King List. So.
Fascinating. Okay, so you have all these, essentially mythical texts that talk about this this god Gilgamesh, and then all of a sudden you have this King's List where he's basically thrown in there, and he's
later
doesn't appear to be. Well, it looks like he's his father was a phantom, or maybe there's another translation you prefer.
Yeah,
that's in the King's List.
That's problematic. He's a little too. And a little too can be a phantom, can be a ghost. This passage is very unclear.
Okay.
And I think so far we haven't deciphered it yet.
Interesting. Okay, but either there's something special about whatever the father's claim to be, right?
Yeah.
But either way, it seems like he's just thrown in there. The people writing it, they didn't have any ability to, fact check whether he was an actual historical person. So one more time, could you talk about why someone would throw him in there? Is it because they actually thought he existed at this time period, or was it making a different message?
Yeah, well, he was remembered as a former king. It's not important that this memory was made up. It was a construction. But this doesn't matter, because at a certain point he was remembered as a former king. And this memory had, of course, had to be part of the Sumerian King List. So at a certain point it was necessary to include him and the others. And most likely this was done under the kings of Ur, because these early Urukian kings, Lugalbanda, Emarkara, and Gilgamesh, was very important for the self-understanding, for their way how they characterize themselves as rulers. So for them, it was important to have these figures being part of the history.
So you think maybe there's an aspect of like at some point someone actually did think that they were a king. They had to put him somewhere.
Yeah.
We need to put him in a list, so we'll put him at the beginning or near the beginning. Fascinating. Okay. All right, and let's see what else we have here. So some scholars have mentioned how Enmindarana is the seventh king in the pre-Flood list. And so he's the seventh king, and of course, in the ancient Near East, the number 7 is extremely special. Very. I'll let you talk about that. Like, why is he mentioned in the 7th in the list? If you think there's a special part to that.
What I would need to do now is to check whether this is the case in all variants of the Sumerian King List, because especially the antediluvian part is quite fluid. We have different traditions there, and not always the sequence is identical of the cities, and also the numbers of kings varies. And so the first question would be, is this specific to this text we have here, the Wald-Blundell prism, or is that a general feature? Let's say it's a general feature, then it can be meaningful that he's mentioned as at position 7, but it needn't to be meaningful. I'm not sure whether this kind of counting was part of their concept.
Interesting. Okay.
So.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. And let's see. Yep. So it's okay if you're not an expert in this area, but if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to share. So in the biblical text, of course, you have a bunch of not kings, but I guess people that are they live really long, and then there's a flood, and then they're still living really long after that, but it's lowering off.
Yeah.
So would you say it's the same concept here, or do you think something different's going on? Do you have any thoughts there?
Maybe two thoughts. The first is this is a general feature of every form of this kind of historiography that I think we have this in Turkey, in China, if I'm not mistaken, that the early kings always rule very long, or the early people live very long, and the more we get to a historical time, the shorter the lifespan becomes. And one explanation for that is that this is also maybe a psychological aspect. The more distant the past is, the shorter is our perception of a time span in this past. So when we're talking about something that happened 100 years before, this sounds incredibly long. Like 1924 is very far away.
Yeah.
But when we think about, okay, what happens 100 CE and 200 CE, and this time span doesn't feel like something that is really relevant to us today. And so one way to keep the relevance is to expand these time spans. So this is one explanation you could do. But the other is, as you said, we have the very long time lifespans, then we have the flood, and then it gets shorter. And this is a pattern we see in this specificity, in this peculiarity in the Sumerian King List. And what we know is that the Sumerian King List was copied and further kings were added, not only in the second millennium. We also have the Dynastic Chronicle, which is a kind of continuous unwriting. You say unwriting? To keep on and add new kings, etc. in the first millennium BC. So, and then we also have a bilingual version, not only in Sumerian, but also in Akkadian. So we know that this kind of historiography of the Sumerian King List was continued into the first millennium BCE. And then we get close to the moment when the Bible was created. And a colleague of mine said that the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religion, I hope I remember correctly, are just variants of Near Eastern religions. They were all developed, or the core of it, developed in an environment that was Near Eastern. And when they tried to distance themselves from this environment, they also dealt with this environment. And as in all traditionalistic, to a certain degree, traditionalistic cultures, they used the traditional material, reshaped it for their own purposes. And this is what we can find in the Old Testament quite frequently. And so I would say, without being an expert here, I should add, that we have good reasons to believe that there's a direct influence from the Sumerian King List into the Bible.
Interesting. Okay. Something you talked about in your work is that there's a cyclical nature between the places that are in charge, essentially. Could you talk about that?
Well, this is something that colleagues of mine, especially Jean-Jacques Glasner and Klaus Wilke, discussed, that we have a certain sequence 3 times: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Uruk, Ur, and then different cities integrate in between, but this basic structure we have 3 times. So it looks like we have this kind of cyclical idea in the Sumerian King List. And here this is something that I was able to identify through the new edition of the Sumerian King List in my habilitation, where I could study a lot more sources than that were accessible before. And there I realized this specific sequence, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Uruk, Ur, 3 times, is specific to the Welt-Blundell prison, to one single manuscript. All the others do not have that. And so this specific idea of cyclicity is specific to this one source, and it's nothing that is shared of the Sumerian King List in a more general sense. But in general, there is in later versions of the Sumerian King List, there's the idea that kingship comes back to specific cities, and these
Interesting.
are Kish, Uruk, Ur.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
the general idea is
yeah,
there.
yeah. So this is a more is the source that I got this from is not great, but
Any
so
spellings.
yeah, but either way, so it's like it's a whole line of Kish, and then Uruk, then
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
Kish, Uruk,
Yeah.
Kish, and then
Uruk,
so on.
Ur. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is specific to the Well-Blendell prison. This is not that is not shared by other manuscripts. That's a problem because the first edition was done by Torkel Jacobsen in 1939, a long time ago. And at that time, the Well-Blendell prison was not only the best preserved source, but at that time there were not so much other sources that could give us a broader idea of the Sumerian King List.
Yeah.
And he had to fill a lot of gaps, etc. So he used the best preserved manuscript as the textus receptus, so as his main text. And because this was the edition for more than 80 years, it was, of course, influential because people who worked on the Sumerian King List used his edition. And so this idea of this repetitive pattern became discussed in my field.
I see. So what you're saying is originally it wasn't on there. Originally was not in that order. And then some group of scribes or one specific one came along later and changed the order essentially of some of them?
He swapped Uruk and Ur in the second repetition.
Interesting. And that is that tell us one more time why they would do that. Okay.
Good question. Good question. Maybe to create this pattern, or maybe it was just a memory mistake. We know that some of these manuscripts were written down out of memory. So scribes memorized the text. I imagine it's entirely boring to to learn this text by heart, and then they wrote it down. And so this is one possibility to explain this feature.
So it's not something we can be extremely confident about, but don't you think it's pretty interesting? It'd have to be a pretty big coincidence for it to be that order 3 times in the same text. So like that's pretty unlikely if it's not on purpose. Okay.
The question is, as we only have this one manuscript, and this Well-Blendell prison looks more like a student's piece.
Interesting.
So and it's not a very reliable source. There are a lot of spelling errors and generally a lot of errors. The worst manuscript we have textually, it's the worst manuscript. It's beautiful, but when you look at the text, the worst manuscript we have. So it's not a very reliable source. So it's hard to say whether it was just a mistake or it was done on purpose. And if it was done on purpose, of course, it was done to create this kind of cyclical pattern. More explicitly than we have with a different order of Uruk.
Interesting. Okay. There was a couple more things I wanted to ask you about. Do you have time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. All right. So I was reading your habilitation in it's written in German, all right?
Yes.
So that was difficult in itself.
Sorry for that.
I don't know German, but I was using Google Translate, so I'm sure that worked out great. I did learn a lot, but there's some things where I'm just like, I'm not sure that sounds right. So forgive me, but you talked about maybe there was a gusher that has symbolic or linguistic link, regarding the flood. There was a name. This is the first one mentioned in the second section. So this is Jucur, and that what is the is there a similarity between something about that meaning and the flood?
But in a different way. It's a bit complicated, so I imagine it very hard reading it, even with Google Translate.
Oh, okay.
This King Mushur is also already part of the Sumerian King List in the first manuscript we have.
Okay.
So and I think it's when you translate it, it's like date or date palm. This name Mushur is written with a certain sign, and this same sign is used in the description of the floods in the verb sweep over. So sweep over, this verb is written with the same sign as Mushur. And so my argument is like they used or picked this specific verb to create this connection with Mushur. So Mushur was there first, and then they described the flood and they used this sign, possibly. That's a big question mark. They used this verb to create this reference.
Interesting. Very fascinating. Okay. All right. What about the Lagash Kings List? So, if I understood that correctly, this was like a polemical text, like written in response to this. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I would call it polemic, but it was written in reaction on the Sumerian King List, and so first, the city of Lagash was one of the most important cities in the third millennium, and it's never mentioned in the Sumerian King List. So there's a gap, obviously, or it looks like there's a gap in the Sumerian King List, and we can explain why it was never integrated, never became part of it. There was never the necessity to include it. So it's just a coincidence. Lagash is never mentioned. And it looks like there had been a moment in history where it was important to create something like a counter narrative to the Sumerian King List, and this could be a moment when Babylon got into power, and maybe even under King Samsi-Luna, the son of Hammurabi. There was a uprising in southern Mesopotamia against the Babylonian king, and there was very bloody, and the city was swept out, and so most of the cities in the south were abandoned. So it was a huge catastrophe, and possibly during that time, but this is speculation. It was important to create this kind of counter narrative against the notion of this one kingship. And so what the scribes or the author of this Lagash King List did is to create this kind of counter narrative. And it's not a narrative about kingship, Nam Lugal in Sumerian, but it's about rulership, Nam Ensik. And this is just a title, Ensik, the title of the rulers of Lagash. The kings of Lagash called themselves differently in Sumerian than the king we have in the Sumerian King List, but both terms mean king, actually. So they created this kind of narrative about this other variant of kingship. And now I need to remember that I don't tell you bollocks, because there's a moment. And there's a moment that is not defined in the Sumerian King List, a historical moment. And this is between the floods and before kingship is brought down to heaven a second time. When maybe you can show us the text again. And when you read it, it doesn't look like there's some undefined time slot. So
you're talking about like
40,
right here.
Line 40. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. It looks like this. There was the flood. Kingship was brought down to heaven by the gods a second time to Kish. And this sentence, as I said, is an artifact or a result of the redaction of the Sumerian King List when the antediluvian part was added. And what the scribes of the author of the Lagash King List did is say, oh, look, there's a moment that is not defined. It's between the flood and before the kings brought kingship down from heaven. And in this moment, the gods bestow Lagash with kingship, with this other version of kingship. And then we have this different narrative about all these rulers of Lagash. And so what the idea here is, at least according to my understanding, is our claim is older. Our kingship is more venerable because it was given by the gods before this kingship in the Sumerian King List. And so this king, as mentioned in the Sumerian King List, does not rule over Lagash. So we're independent from this kind of kingship. We have our own king and our own history and our own political narrative. And so it's a story about independence, political independence.
Fascinating. Okay. I actually did have one super chat question. It's okay if you don't know the answer, but how is kingship related to Torques? So does that make any sense to you? I don't know anything about this.
Well, how is king related to Torques? Torch? Sarshawiru? Don't get it, sorry.
Don't understand. That's okay.
No.
All right. One more question I really wanted to ask you here. So, in your habilitation, the English translation of it said there are two clear cases in which rulers are assigned to a new city. The late III redaction assigns Nani and Meshnunan to instead of Cush.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the Queen one. Do you think that you could go into that a little bit?
The Queen one is the much more interesting one here.
Okay.
The other one is they swapped the city for these two rulers. It's hard to say why, but the Queen is interesting because there's only one queen.
Yeah.
In the entire thing. So the Sumerian King List it mentions kings and only one queen, and this is the Queen Kubaba. She's the grandmother of Ursababa, and Ursababa is the king, the competitor of Sargon of Akkad. And this idea that there's a female ruler became a bit problematic in the beginning of the second millennium. So what they did is they separated her from their son and grandson. And she became ruler of her own hegemony. So we have Kish, which city is in between Awan or Akshak, is squeezed in, and then it goes on with Puzursin, the son of Kubaba.
I think we could put it on the screen.
Yeah.
Where's it at? I don't even know where it's at.
It's earlier. It's
earlier. Okay.
Go up a bit. It's here. No, a bit up, please. Sorry. Okay, stop. Here, so 224 in Kish Kubaba, the woman tavern keeper who made firm the foundation of Kish became king. Interesting. She's always labeled as King Lugal, not as queen. She ruled for 100 years, one king, etc. So here we see she's only king. There's only one king for this hegemony of Kish. Then we have Akshak. Yeah, it was Akshak, and then it goes on after Akshak. If you could scroll up a bit to 200. The other direction, down. 244. In Kish, Puzursin, the son of Kubaba, became king. He ruled for 25 years. So what's interesting here, we still have the filiation. We see Puzursin is the son of Kubaba. And then when we check the numbers of the hegemony of Akshak in between, it's something like 87 or 110 years. So this is impossible. So without having further manuscripts, we already can see here that there was something done with the text, and that this Akshak hegemony was squeezed in between Kubaba and her son. And we have a lot of manuscripts giving testimony that they were part of one hegemony, and that Akshak was either before or after.
Okay, so just for clarity, so you had this woman, quote unquote, king, and in other texts we have that woman the son of that woman is all the way down here.
Yeah. So it continues in 244. So it goes on directly at one after the other. One reason could be that they didn't like the idea of a woman.
Yeah.
Or they wanted to push her back in the past, which could also be a positive thing. So she was a very early ruler, and 100 years is quite long.
Yeah.
In comparison to all the rulers around. And here's another important aspect, because Kubaba, we have this additional information of this queen, and this additional information, biographical information, is quite rare in the Sumerian King List. We usually have that in case of outstanding rulers, like Sargon of Akkad or Etana, who flew to heaven on the back of an eagle. So we have quite seldom this kind of additional information, but in the case of Kubaba, we have that. And a lot of scholars read that in a very negative way. She's a tavern keeper, former tavern keeper. That's a low social position. So they said, well, she's labeled negatively here. However, if you look a bit closer, what you highlight here, who made firm the foundations of Kish, this is very positive. To make firm the foundations of a city or of a hegemony. And quite often this is also a cipher for that she established a dynasty. And we see her son and her grandson rule in Kish. So this is very positive. So what about the tavern keeper? And and here it's quite interesting when we compare Kubaba with Sargon of Akkad. And in the case of Sargon of Akkad, we have this idea that he was a cupbearer. And the tavern keeper and the cupbearer both provide beverage for people. And this is a general, or we can say sustenance. And this is a general task of a king, according to Mesopotamian understanding, to provide for the people. And both are expert for that. Sargon as a former cupbearer and Kubaba as a former tavern keeper. So this is actually a positive label here. And so it's important to read these kind of qualifications in this respective culture, and there it is a positive label.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So maybe you don't have to spend as much time on it, but I was still interested. You said it was a little bit less interesting, but still, I think it's a real fun one. So late redaction assigns Nani and Mishnun to instead of Kish. So where is that at? Do you know? It says 3 redaction though. So that would be lower.
It must be 2. This it should be the other way. Or it should be the other way. Mari, Ada before Anab.
Is that Nani right there?
Or here we have Nani. Yeah.
Okay. And what happened there?
And the son of Nani and Meshnune. Where's Meshnune? Okay. The name is not preserved on this Well-Pandel prison, I think.
Oh, on this specific text.
Yeah. Why did they do that? One reason could be because Kish is very dominant in the Sumerian King List. The most of the rulers are rulers of Kish, and originally all these rulers were part of one hegemony. So we had kingship was brought down from heaven to Kish, and then we have a list of like 50 rulers of Kish, and then it happens the first time that the kingship is moved on, and then in later redactions this is split up, the long reign of Kish, and maybe this was also a way to cut it down even further, to have less kings of Kish, to get rid of this dominance of Kish in general.
So essentially, they were willing to change the quote-unquote history of where they were located to just make them look worse, hypothetically.
Well, these scribes who redacted, or the kings who redacted the list, were most likely kings or scribes of the city of Ur, so Ur III Empire, or Isin. and in both or in all cases, he didn't, or no, put it differently. At that time, Kish wasn't important anymore, and this idea of this dominant city didn't fit in or didn't suit the times anymore. So they changed it, and yeah, and maybe the city of Kish was labeled too positively in the king list, and they wanted to change that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay. All right. So this is just more explanation from what the one person was saying. So let me know if you have any thoughts here. It's okay if not.
Yeah.
And he also said this here. JC, I
Yeah,
do appreciate you supporting the channel. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's getting this is it's getting too speculative. I'm sorry that
Speculative.
yeah. Yeah, Tertu is yeah, it's instruction. It's also quite often it's instruction by the gods. Yeah, but using the same signs and Char and Chosang, but Chosang is different. This is yeah. No, it's getting a bit too bringing us too far away from the topic. I'm sorry that I can. I appreciate the explanation, but there's nothing I can say something on about. I'm sorry.
Okay, much appreciated. Alrighty. And JS was really wanting people to know about it. So your German habilitation, could you maybe quickly go like so that's not like a typical dissertation from like America. So could you talk about that? Not like a typical PhD.
Yeah, well, the PhD we also have in Germany. That's the first book you have to write, and then you have to write a second book in Germany. That's the habilitation, which qualifies you for a professorship. Before that, you are not eligible to apply for a professorship. And in Germany, we only have senior professorships. The idea of junior professorships or assistant professorships is still something that is quite young for the German system. We're talking about 20 years. The system is quite conservative, especially in humanities and in the study of the ancient cultures. So, yeah. And so this second book you have to write is this is called Habilitation. So this is what I did, and this was a new edition of the Sumerian King List after 80 years, or 80 years after the edition of Torgert Jacobsen.
Yeah.
And so after the habilitation, you're allowed to call yourself Privatdozent. This is a very German title too, meaning you don't have a professorship, but you have the qualification.
Fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
And something you said that was really interesting is you said that the one that Jacobsen was his original thing that all the other scholars were basing that off. You said that one had the most errors on it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is not specific to the Wild Mandel prison. This is something that also other scholars observed for prisons in general. So this four-sided manuscript, this heavy objects, they look really beautiful. Sometimes they have also 5 or 6 sides, and yeah, they are always beautiful, but most times they give us the worst version of a text.
Oh, wow.
The text quality is the worst. Yeah.
That's a fun archaeological question. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So this is a riddle that needs to be solved. We still do not know why.
Yeah, that's fun. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. Was there anything else that you wanted people to know about?
At the moment, not really.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Is there if it wasn't already clear, this text that I've been showing on the screen, that's in the description. You can check out Dr. Gabriel's his academia page where he's got a lot of his work on there. Is there any other places people can check out your work, or you want people to know about as far as what you've written on or books you've written on?
Yeah, maybe the best source is because my academia page is not very. I do not put a lot of effort in it.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you want to have recent information, just check out my webpage at the Freie Universität Berlin.
Okay.
So Google my name, and normally it's one of the first hits, and
Awesome.
then you get there. And
Awesome.
there's always an English version, a German and English version.
Very nice. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute
Thank
pleasure.
you.
This is a really, really cool, interesting topic, and I'm sure people really appreciate it. But otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.